here. I'm looking presentable because I have some really controversial beliefs that I have to share with you guys today.
Well, judging on the title, this controversial belief is going to have something to do with the idea that Afrocentrists are the only people who believe that ancient Egyptians were black and were mixed with black people for the most part forever. But let's see if your controversial take will be consistent with DNA evidence.
My bed looks messy too. No, you guys, I'm an absolute mess today. But yeah, I have some pretty controversial beliefs that I have to share with you guys today. And so all I'm gonna say is get ready. Like Metatron said, brace, brace, brace.
I love how Metatron has become the face for anti-black Egypt, even though he's pushing a mixed Egypt. So you're not even gonna say the same thing that he's gonna say, but okay. Also, let's just see what else he has to say.
Look how, bro, look at how defined my like bicep is, bro. I'm telling you, bro. All you people who make these like those Wojak memes, and you got like the Chad, and then you got the like. I watch Hamza videos, so I just know the Wojak is like Jeffrey, but you got the Chad and like the incel, bro. The Chad. I want you to trust me, bro, in this video, okay?
I'm getting a little too old for this internet stuff. What the hell was that?
Trust me, bro. No science, no explanation. I'm just gonna say what I want to say, and you can't say anything about it. Can't say nothing, can't question me. Don't ask me for a source. Okay, I'm joking. But I'm just gonna say it. I don't think we need any more ancient Egyptian samples, specifically for the debate about whether the ancient Egyptians were black or not. Because honestly, we already kind of know the answer. And if you have half a brain, you would know that the descendants of the ancient Egyptians are modern day Egyptians.
Okay, so a lot was said there. Firstly, you can't claim that people are not scientific and then say you want less samples, not more. Hey, let's stop doing DNA testing because we already know the answer. How? How do we already know the answer? We haven't genetically tested a lot of people. We have a lot of genetic evidence from England, but we have to still keep testing because there might be something controversial or weird as things have happened over and over again. In China, they've been testing and testing and testing, and finally they found foreign samples. In India, they found foreign samples. It's not, you can't just tell people to stop testing and to say, obviously, they're like modern Egyptians. What the hell is a modern Egyptian to you? What is that? Is the modern Egyptian the Arabs that came during the Golden Age, the Persians that came during the Golden Age? Is it the black people who came through the slave trade, who admittedly by the people who did the 2017 genetic test said that there was a 10% increase in modern Egyptians? So how can they be exactly like the modern Egyptians if their DNA evidence is different? Now, I know you didn't say exactly like the ancient Egyptians, but there's something kind of strange about claiming that the modern Egyptians are the same as the old Egyptians when we know damn well that the genetic evidence points to the fact that they're not.
Now I will say there's a lot of stuff that goes into this argument, and I've already made a video addressing most of the Afrocentric arguments that I hear a lot of the time, and I've made other videos as well addressing some of the more ambiguous parts of it, like race, when it comes to like assigning races to different types of people. I think and even also as well like the push back then for ancient Egypt to be a non-black civilization by European archaeologists. So I don't want people to say that I don't know, because I've believed that the ancient Egyptians were black. I've used a lot of the arguments that a lot of people in the Afrocentric community have used.
Well, since he already knows that the archaeologists from the past used to, at least most of them, used to push the idea that all civilizations in Africa were European or Middle Eastern, anything but black, doesn't it hit you as suspicious that that's what we're getting today? And of course, I'm going to show something else where they keep switching between ancient Egyptians were white and ancient Egyptians were Middle Eastern. because they really want to say they were white, but because the DNA doesn't favor them that much, they're saying the Middle Eastern, but they keep switching when they tell the media.
Now, I'm not saying I'm the smartest person, I'm not the most well-read person, but I think I'm somebody who figured something out. And I'm just gonna go straight in for the kill, bro. A lot of people just spurg out about ancient DNA samples not being old enough, not the studies not having enough DNA samples or certain things like that. And these might be fair things, but
Wait, you're saying it might be fair to not take recent things where there have been multiple evasions from the Hyksos, from other people from the Middle East and parts of Upper Europe? You don't think it's fair to think that there might have been a genetic change, especially considering the wide invasion of an Indo-European group? And we know that Indo-Europeans, after a while, would do some replacements. You think it's not fair to judge that the samples might have changed? I'd like people to point this to me because this happened in the Metatron debate as well. What part of the world had such a wide amount of control from foreigners but had no genetic impact? I'd love to hear that. What area of the world has people who came in and completely owned the area and then had no genetic impact whatsoever? To think that the ancient Egyptians of the very beginning, even after the Nubian invasion, the Libyan invasion, the Hyksos invasion, the Middle Eastern invasions, they would not have changed even a little bit. The Arab invasion, not even a little bit, they would have changed. When has that ever happened anywhere on earth? Where does this argument come from? Now I want you to compare this to another place in history. For example, because let's talk about Indo-Europeans for a second. If you take a sample of Greeks from before 2000 BCE, you will not have any Indo-European DNA in there. But then you start getting Indo-European DNA around 2000 BC. The Indo-Europeans spread throughout Europe, sort of mixing with the people who were already there. If you think that at one point you can just stop and say, okay, now we've collected the DNA, and this DNA probably goes back about 50,000 years or 15 or 10,000, or no matter how long you think, you're being silly. There's no place on earth where the genetics of the people were just consistently the same throughout the entire time. People move.
honestly, if you know anything about African DNA in general and you're not just so Egypt focused, you would know that Eurasian ancient Egyptians having Eurasian like DNA, especially that related to Natufians. If you don't know, please check out my video.
Okay, since the next sentence is not related to this sentence here, I'm going to have to talk about this sentence. Saying that if you know anything about African history outside of Egypt, and then talking about the Natufians, who the Natufians, according to the studies, would have gone through Egypt, again, it makes no sense. There is no need to invoke the rest of Africa when you talk about Natufians. If you talk about Natufians, you're talking about North Africa for the most part. And I don't know what is the point of bringing up Natufians, because the Natufians debunk something that you just said, which is ancient Egyptians from the past. We've done the DNA. Okay, we've done the DNA, they're done. Well, if Natufians enter, that means that the DNA at some point will be different than the DNA that comes later. Because you do believe, right, that modern Egyptians are not 100% Natufians, and you do believe that they're not the race of people who were there before the Natufians came.
Why Afrocentrists are claiming ancient Egyptians and Natufians are black. It's not uploaded at the time of this recording, but it should be by the time you receive this video. But
If the arguments in that video are as strong as the ones in here, I'm very terrified. Although you do know that the group that you should probably be looking at are the Ibero-Maurusians, who have sub-Saharan African DNA rather than the Natufians, given that the Natufians can be isolated outside of Africa, whereas the Ibero-Maurusians have been seen with African sub-Saharan African DNA.
Honestly, I even called out in this video, one of my main points was that there's a double standard when it comes to ancient DNA samples, and just when it comes to this argument in general. There are certain inconsistencies. For example, people use quotes of Herodotus for, ancient Egyptians being black who lived in a certain time period, and then when we get DNA samples from that time period, that time period no longer is good enough.
Another silly argument. No one is saying that you can't use DNA from that time period. In fact, you can. But let's first address two things. Firstly, the 2017 study that was done in that time period, but was done in one small location. That was the problem. And the area that it was done in is known to be frequented by foreigners, the Al Fayoum area. We know that it's frequented by foreigners, and there's several samples you can check from around different parts of YouTube done by real Egyptologists to talk about that area is frequented by foreigners. Secondly, it's a small area with a small sample size, and they only got a few DNA and assumed the rest. Lastly, they did find black DNA in these people at about 4 to 16%. And then they said that there was an increase, not they started from zero, there was an increase from 4% to 20% in modern samples. So modern samples have about 20%. You saying that there's zero is weird. So let's read two parts that will show how weird the statement is. Okay, up to 20% consistent with nuclear estimates of 80% non-African ancestry reported in Pegani. Genetic continuity between ancient and modern Egyptians cannot be ruled out by our formal test, despite this sub-Saharan African influx, while continuity with modern Ethiopians who carry 60% African L lineages is not supported. To further test genetic affinities and shared ancestry with modern day African and Western Eurasians populations, we performed a principal component analysis, PCA, based on haplogroup frequencies and multidimensional scaling of pairwise genetic distances. Okay, and as you can see here, their estimation is that the ancient Egyptians are more consistent, the ones done in that test are more consistent with Middle Easterners than they are with modern day Egyptians. And they're saying despite this influx of black African ancestry, there could be a continuity with the modern Egyptians. Could be, not there is. And then they're saying that they rule out the one of the Ethiopians, which, again, that's their choice to do that. But if we go by what they are saying, there should be no difference between Middle Easterners and ancient and modern Egyptians at all. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. I'm saying that modern Egyptians, according to these people, no, ancient Egyptians, according to these people, are genetically the same as Middle Easterners, to the point that an influx of black DNA throws the thing sideways to a point where you can't even just declare, like, okay, without the African ancestry, they would be 100% the same. All this tells me is that modern Egyptians and Middle Eastern people and this sample are foreigners of Egypt. Well, here's the question. Why would I say this? Well, simple. Because remember the Indo-European thing I was telling you about? Well, the Indo-European people, it affected the Middle East, and they also affected the modern day Egyptians, which is why it's no surprise that we find this DNA within these samples of both modern people of these areas.
So, that's just one inconsistency. But essentially, it's like how much can we cope? How far back do we have to go? Now, I will admit that there was some level of sub-Saharan African genetic components in ancient Egyptians, but that would have been mostly related to East Africans, and it wouldn't have been that high. There are actually ancient Egyptian samples on G25 from the Old Kingdom that show that the ancient Egyptians from Old Kingdom had actually no sub-Saharan ancestry. And there's a Middle Kingdom sample that showed that there was only a minor East African component, which was, it had some like East African related stuff. It could be represented by Dinka or the Cushitic peoples.
Well, judging on the chart that he just gave, it's not insignificant. We're talking about 7.8% East African Nilotic Dinka DNA, which it's not insignificant. And given the time of the DNA, don't you find it strange that there's a much higher amount of East African DNA in this one than there is in later samples?
Now, while the validity of some of these DNA samples can be questioned due to things like quality of the samples and other things like that, and just the fact that these samples are unpublished, I will note one thing is that they're very high in Natufian. And so for all of you creators out there who push Black Egypt, right? I have a question for you, and that is what would make prehistoric ancient Egyptians not Natufian like?
See, now there's a really good question. What could possibly make these people not Natufian like since they have such high Natufian DNA? Well, it could be, now I'm no expert, it could be all the other DNA that they have that's not Natufian. That might make them not look like a pure Natufian. I don't know. Again, I'm not an expert at figuring out what a Natufian is, but judging by the rest of the samples, which take up about 47% of the DNA, I would say that's what's making them look different than a normal Natufian. Do me a favor, find a woman, right? Have a child with them, test their DNA and make sure it's about 47% and see if your DNA is going to be if your kid is going to look like you if he has 47% outside DNA.
If you disagree, all right, that's if you disagree, because some people will tell you that the Natufians were black people, which I've already responded to that claim in that previous video I mentioned before. Why are Afrocentrists claiming that they're black? But
I'm going to make a few guesses that you're going to say that the Natufians, there's no way in hell they could be black, even though we don't know exactly what the Natufians look like. And given some of the people who existed at the same time as the Natufians, a lot of people, even as far as Europe, were black back then. So black is different than African. I want you to understand that. Black is different than African. Their appearance could have appeared black, even though they have a unique DNA than Africans. Let's first get that in your mind. And then secondly, we have to understand that people change. Even though there's a genetic continuity between old Europeans and new Europeans, they didn't look the same. This is what Cheddar Man looked like. And if you can see, Cheddar Man looks closer to a sub-Saharan African than he does a European, even though some of the European features are starting to set in. Cheddar Man is from about the 9th millennium BC, and if you see here, the Natufians are from the 12,500 BC, which is pre Cheddar Man era. I mean, it is in the same region, same time. So if you were just going to assume that all Europeans look the same all the way back, then you would be very mistaken. As you can see here, it's possible that these people did look like that. But then because people from the Middle East would have fused with these people, including later people like the Indo-Europeans, and now you're taking what modern people look like today and you're throwing it on ancient people, which is not surprising given that your first statement was we can stop doing DNA tests. We can't, because the further back you look, the more complicated the story is.
But what exactly would make them any different to being Natufian? Like, I've already mentioned how the admixture between ancient Nilo-Saharan speaking communities or ancient Nilo-Saharan like communities genetically, so proto-Nilotic is how it's called in a lot of the how do you say it, bro? These like online forums, these places with incels, bro, who care about this stuff, who the only people really, or only people who really look at it. What would make it like any different? You know? Because I'll be very honest with you, when you really think about it, and you look at the DNA samples of ancient Africa and its surrounding areas, specifically around Egypt, you look at the Ibero-Maurusians who, showed evidence that they had DNA from a Eurasian back migration that happened during the Paleolithic period, with about like most of their DNA being Natufian-like. Which came from a source population from, like that was Zudzuena-like, which is from the Caucasus Mountains, if you guys don't know. And the rest of their DNA being sub-Saharan West African. And then we also have samples in Nubia that were basically East African genetically, but then also had significant amounts of West Eurasian related ancestry related to that of the Levant. And then the Levant's literally bordering Egypt. We have these these are real samples that exist, the studies exist, I can drop them, you know what I mean? What would make the ancient Egyptians different? What makes Egypt different from that?
What would make Egypt different than that? All the other DNA you showed, which by the way also impacted lots of people in the Middle East. Also saying the people of the Caucasus region, the people of the Caucasus region today are not the people of the Caucasus region back in the day, especially back then. I mean, that's like the area that the Indo-Europeans took to the Middle East.
I mean, even Nubians, at certain times had like high levels of Eurasian ancestry, even more than some of their sub-Saharan African ancestry. We have the Kadruka sample, which was from south of Kerma in Upper Nubia.
First of all, that's only one person. And secondly, no one's denying that people can move. So obviously, there might have been one person whose DNA is traced from that area. But Upper Kerma, these regions of the Sudanese Lower Egyptian areas are known to be frequented by people who are of sub-Saharan origin. I mean, that part is obvious.
And later samples from Christian period, from Kulubnarti.
The later period that shows the Christians show that the majority of the Christians were females that moved from Egypt into the Dinkas, which were males. And I don't know what that has to do with this older sample, because that's only one. The consistent DNA that we can see here is Dinka over and over again. Dinka in the Egyptians, Dinka in ancient samples, and Dinka in newer samples.
It's just a question, because when you really think about it, why would he do like what? If like I'd be actually curious to ask as well. If some of these people who push Black Egypt, if I could ask them to, what would be the average Egyptian's genetics, DNA composition, on average, like what percentage of this and what percentage of that, what would you give them, and why would you give them those results? Would you tell me that they had Niger Congo or West African DNA, Bantu and Central African DNA? Would they have high East African DNA? Would you tell me that they were Natufian, but then tell me that the Natufians were black? Would you tell me Egyptian, which is just like you're just avoiding the question? I mean, I just want to know. Now,
well, the best way to know is to do more genetic tests, which you said in the beginning you were against. So If you really, really want to know what most people think they were, most people think that they were some cross between two black populations, the Natufians, who would have been black at the time, because white people didn't really exist 12,000 years ago, and their movement into Egypt would have meant almost nothing in terms of their physical appearance. But of course, once you're outside of Africa, the continent, now you don't count as black anymore. But let's carry on. What do we think they would have looked like? They probably would have looked like what a lot of other Africans who are mixed look like. They probably would have looked like something like East Africans. Or they would have looked like their statues. That's another thing they could look like. But let me ask you a question. What do you think they look like? Do you think they look like Middle Easterners today, even though Middle Easterners today don't look exactly like Middle Easterners looked like back then? Which is obvious considering their DNA. Nothing I'm saying, by the way, is my opinion so far. So, for example, let's look at this genetic test. It talks about that most Indian groups descend from a mixture of two genetically divergent populations: ancestral North Indians related to Central Asians, Middle Easterners, Caucasians, and Europeans, and ancestral South Indians, not closely related to groups outside the subcontinent. So, as I showed you with that thing, there's the Indo-European influx, which came with Iranian, which is Middle Eastern. It came with all these other groups, and it fused with the Indians today. And you see Indians, you can see that some of them are very dark, and then some of them are very light. This recent Indo-European influx changed the skin color of a lot of Indians that became very, very light skinned, which is odd considering that they're kind of equatorial. So, this equatorial influx of these new people shows that there is a difference, a large difference between what they used to be and what they are today. And that's India. That's one of the places that they went to. What do you think they did in the Middle East, where they traveled through to get to India?
I think that both you and I, you who are watching this, you as the creator who might be spurking out, reacting to my video, or whatever you might be doing right now, sitting in your room where we both know what is more likely, from a genetics. And that's the thing that I like about genetics and ethnolinguistics. It can cut straight to the point. If you know what a Kushite is, and you know what a Nilotes is, you know what a Bantu is in West Africa, you're pretty much solid when it comes to African history. There's obviously a lot of other things that you have to know and learn about, but if you know those basic concepts, if you know how genetic clustering works, you know about how different ethnic groups, ethno-linguistic groups are grouped together, you will be alright. But anyways, with that being said, thank you for coming to the end of this video. And if you're wanting...
And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Solid proof that ancient Egyptians weren't black. Somehow we went from no DNA of black people, and then finding some DNA of black people, and then, first of all, having less than 500 samples, and then declaring that, okay, all Egyptians were Middle Eastern, even though they don't match all Middle Easterners, and even Middle Easterners don't match all Middle Easterners. Of course, if you just stare at Africa alone, you're gonna have this impression that Africa is this one thing, and blah, blah, and you should ignore. If you look at all populations from around the world, it will become obvious to you that you can't play the game of the people today are the people of the past. That's not true anywhere. Even Africa. People don't even know that people in Africa didn't look like the way they look today. If you take an African 40,000 years ago, he did not look like what he looks like today.